It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce Professor Hagengruber, who many of you probably already know, if not read extensively. Professor Ruth Hagengruber is the founder and director of the Center for History of Women Philosophers and Scientists at Paderborn University in Germany, which of course has become quite a central hub in restudying the history of philosophy and recuperating lost voices. At Paderborn University, she's also head of the department, head of the philosophy department. And among her many publications, which not just focus on early modernity, but also span early phenomenologists as well as late antiquity thinkers. Her most recent publications are Women Philosophers from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, co-edited with Sarah Hutton. Women Phenomenologists on Social Ontology, Re-Experiences, Communal Life and Joint Action, co-edited with Sebastian Luft. And finally, Methodological Reflections on Women's Contributions and Influence in the History of Philosophy. Professor Hagengruber, please take the floor, and we look forward to your talk.
So, this is how I would like to introduce what I have to say, and to make it the start, because the talk I would like to offer you today is in truth, we could say, put away this wrong history of philosophy, because it is without truth. It is, as we had calculated, the planetary system of our sun without taking into account every second planet. The problem is that this history that we are taught is not the right history. And I would like to start to remind you how you think the world has been before Newton. So since Newton, we understand that the planets are in a dynamic constellation to each other. And as this talk is dedicated to Hypatia, I would like to remind you that it was Hypatia, and I will refer also to Du Châtelet, who worked a lot on space. Space is a means of our consciousness, how we see that. And the cosmological history is very parallel to the history of women philosophers. And this is an interesting point. Think that Hypatia was murdered. Hypatia was a cosmologist. Hypatia had the idea from the Platonic and ancient tradition that the earth is not in the center of the universe. Please understand that then for 1,000 years, it was common view to think the earth is in the center of the universe. And this was only the idea of another philosopher. And interestingly, the earth is turning around. So it is this cosmological view. You all know, I think, what happened to Hypatia and what happened to her writings. And I would like to remind you to understand how history goes. So the high evolution of women also within institutions, let's say at least to a part, and she was a dominant figure in a dominant institution. And this is why she and her writings have been murdered. And then 1,000 years together with a completely new religion, the religion that was established from that time on was new insofar as we don't know any religion before that was without women. You know, so there, if you go back in history to the Hittites, to the Hattites, to the Egyptians, to the Greeks, and to the Germans and so on, you don't find any religion, so any metaphysical personalized status without women. But now you enter a sphere of 1,000 years, more or less, let's say 900 years, and it is not by random that this is also the time span when Platonism was more or less gone. It is the time when Aristotle was read, and Aristotle was also received in the core of these new traditions, as you know. And when Hypatia came back, so the Renaissance is said, even by Jakob Burckhardt, who said, in the Renaissance and humanism, women have been equalized. They had the equal status. So if we can discuss that, but at least, you know, you see that there is such a huge presence, and you have to understand that this presence comes along with the downbreak of Aristotelianism. And I like to use this woodcut from Hans Baldung Green, who was a student from Albrecht Dürer. Phyllis writing now on Aristotle, because Aristotle, and of course, this is with a bit satirical, and it is a satirical journalistic truth, what we see here. And this woodcut was spread all over Europe. You find this in so many versions. It was, you know, it was what people laughed about, because this was the new reality. Women now hit the old Aristotle, who tried to force women into the box, who said, look into this world, how weak women are, and they are minor to men because they are smaller to men. Look, they are the seed box for the seed of the males. And look what we see. This is empirical philosophy. We see that all the things are falling down to the earth. That is clear that the earth is in the center of the universe. So this is the methodology which is in the back. And putting this methodology away and saying, no, what I see might be that I see that, but it might not be that this is the truth, because you can't see the causes of what you see. And the causes of what you see are not connected to what you see. And this is, so this post-Aristotelian or a strong critique against Aristotle that started here, started a completely new movement that reformed itself, and women reformed itself, and it was already mentioned now. The whole tradition of women philosophers, they started to rediscover their own tradition, as you do today. It was already done. And they, like the male tradition, starts with the Socrates. This female tradition started with Diotima. And it did so till so you will see that from the 14th, 15th century on, the reference to Diotima as the start of philosophy, and the footnotes, you know, not Plato or Plato, Socrates, but Plato, Diotima, become very important for that. And it keeps up to the 19th century. So the latest I know, but surely she will not be the latest, but one of the big texts that is known to everybody is by Harriet Taylor Mill. That is about 500 years. This tradition, taken now back to Diotima, into the tradition of women philosophers, was kept. You know that this is a time when antiquity was broadly rediscovered, and I only for reminding you. And there is also what is less known, and there is a lot to be said about that. If we only collected now all the material that nearly in all countries I know in Europe, the recollection of the voices of women philosophers was established for centuries. You have many, many texts. So I, of course, know very many texts from Germany, but there is a huge and a very interesting discussion within that, to which I can't go deeper now, but if somebody wants to know, I say something about that. So you have this lists that are created in that period that demonstrate the influential history of women tracing back their traditions into mythical ages, as does Christine de Pizan. But so this is a start. Christine de Pizan's writes, I had discussions with Karen Green, still beyond Platonism and the new entrance of Platonism. And from Platonism on, it becomes that the initiatives came back to the Pythagorean women, as I've shown with Ménage, and they were not the only one. So it is not that only women wrote on that. It is Boccaccio. We have a huge literature on that, and we have also a renewal, as we have today, in political utopia. So it was clear that this interest that these women had was not an interest of their own. It was not, and sometimes this happens still, that it is seen as a particular and a defense interest of women. But it was even in that time understood that it was the women's concern, which was the universal claim, and that the oppression and subjugation of women was a hurt against the universal claim, and that it was the Meyns side who defended the particular concern. This is clearly seen, as you have already said, Joyce, in Christine de Pizan. Christine de Pizan calls the history of male philosophers a philopholy. She says, and this is true, and I am happy to quote that several times today. She says, what is a philopholy? A philopholy is when everybody only quotes what is already known. And this is also what is done. And as you know, and as I will show you, so I come back to that. So the point is, what I would like to make, it is not only, and I think this is also a reading, I would say we have to broaden. Christine de Pizan, it was not her main idea to defend her against the males. It was her main idea to write philosophy of Lady Reason, to write a true philosophy of reason, and not of not reason, of reason and experience. This is what she clearly says. And this is what the women do. They don't say, oh, you bad boys, you are so miserable against us women and so on. They said, no, you're doing wrong and bad philosophy. You are bad philosophers. This is what Isotta Nogarola does when she's criticizing Augustine. She says, Augustine, all your holdings are contradictory. It is bad philosophy what you're doing. And so Joyce might be interested in that because you are doing this. These incredible women of the early Venice, and it's not by random that it is Venice at that time that these women flourish here, because of course Venice defended the Byzantine Empire, and the Greek sources came first to Venice before then they spread, and you know that it was in Venice that Plato was published and so on. So okay, I have to show. So there's in that time, that early time, new traditions are started, and it is 300 years later that still Olympe de Gouges says, this tradition that we have built up is now stolen again by the males. And it is the tradition of Bible critiques. You have not the Bible critiques of the 20th century. You have the Bible critics of the 14th and 15th century. And because a God is no male, this is bad philosophy. It's purely nonsense. And you all have to learn and to understand that it is evidently so easy for people to believe nonsense. So when I'm talking to theologians, no theologian is denying that God can't be a male. So if it is omnipotent, it is everything. So it is really difficult for the church. Why we have to say, mon Dieu, mon Père, you know, what all over Europe and many places beyond, young girls have to say, mon Dieu, mon Père. And women have long fought. And what we think now, what is the Bible critiques of the 18th century and in the Enlightenment, was in truth funded by the women from that early period on. And there is a whole tradition in these things. And I only would like to quote the phenomenal Emily de Châtelet here. And she says, so this is such a nonsense, what is written in the Bible. I don't know if it was possible today that somebody is so courageous to say some things like that. And you know, all these thick and big books on Bible critiques of the 18th century, like from Israel and so on, it is, you know, they are ignoring writing nonsense on women. Really writing nonsense on women. So I have written here, Pressing Enlightenment, you see it, some of that. Du Châtelet says it clearly. So what is written there is against the laws of nature. And yeah, so you have to decide. Either you go to the narratives or you go to rationality. I also would like to remind you that it was not a question in that time of equality, but it was also the discussion of superiority of women, because women have understood that the history as it has developed was a self-subjection, you know, to irrational principles. I have already referred, and I start here again with Diotima, because Diotima becomes the important figure. So Marie de Gournay, who is still under-evaluated philosopher, to my view, today. So there are a few people starting now working on her. She was a very, very strong philosopher in a very strong context, discussing, and she wrote already in 1622, she drafted an inclusive history where females and males are part. And I think this is exactly the what we have to do now, that we go through our canons and that we reread that, and that we are trying to create the better canon of life. So as I've already said, Diotima becomes the progenitor, the progenitrix of the women's history referred to in such a long time. And this is important because this Diotima, who is in feminism of the 20th century, again, read with the eyes of the analytic Aristotelian anti-Platonism. You know, at that time, Diotima was a huge figure who allowed the philosophers to start a completely different metaphysics. So this metaphysics of love. And somebody, I think it was also a choice, who talked about Tullia d'Aragona, but we have a story of love, which is, I don't know if you know, that Hegel's concept was first the concept of love. So overcoming differences. This was the idea, and Frederick Beiser rightly branded the German early Enlightenment, the early Enlightenment, as the children of Diotima. And this is, so the Diotima metaphysics is a much more, so starting from the real world metaphysics, it is completely different. And you see that all women can contribute to that history. And what I would like to say from the methodological point of view is that you have to follow exactly these concepts that women have worked out. And this is why I show you, we have in our encyclopedia already, and I ask you also to contribute that, because it's so important to see then the long traditions of a new philosophy. Only a short word that I have said, and coming back to that, that this was integrating. Women are the half of the world, of all the planets and of all the dynamics which is evolving in the world. And Thomas Morus and Tommaso Campanella and many, many more, but those were the most important, who have drafted a utopia, including women. So, so you have to understand that what happens now, for me, is only a new wave of elder waves that have been have already happened. And now, once again, back to the methodological implications of that reading. The problem is, how can we leave these categories that have been used for such a long time against women, these categories of the upper and the under and of the superiorist and the minor things. And this is what you have already referred to, what I always have to refer to, because this is the greatest danger, in my view, for the new world side, that the people are continuing to read history within the categories that have been now traditionalized. So, and this is what Simone de Beauvoir does. As she knows all these famous names, she says, and it is clear, and this was not her aim, and I love Simone de Beauvoir, but here she said, oh, these women, they all reflected the ideas of males. And you have to think that these big women of feminist philosophy and history did the same. And when you read them, you read this idea, and this is why Joyce has to say, I think they were proto-feminists, because they say, you know, Gerda Lerner, Renaissance philosophy had the right to Nogarola, Fidele, Marinella, Pizan, blah, blah. But current scholarship holds that these women made no significant impact on the writings of philosophy. But this is because Lerner and King move within the categories they are educated in. They don't succeed to leave that kind of thinking. So they criticize by confirming the confirmed. Yes, and this is also the reason why a huge time and energy resources went into rereading the male's bad work. Forget it, because your life is short and you don't have the time to read this once again. What these have, well, you compare your life with 100 euros and don't spend 50 euros on reading the wrong history of science. It would be. So how do we come out of this box? How do we come out of these Aristotelian box of hierarchies, of functions, of ascriptions? And this is, as you surely know, it was the beginning. Plato talked about faculties, and I could talk a lot about Plato and love it, because this is a very different concept, and this is also the reason why Plato has women in this significant role as teachers also of Socrates. And why is it that Simone de Beauvoir read the whole history of women philosophers as a history of victims and denied that they ever have been the agents of such a history? Yeah. And I remind you to the philosophy of Christine de Pizan, who had much better understood that this history is simply a wrong history, and that you, so to say, within waves of. So the methodological change, what does it allow you to see? It allows you, as I have already said, that the history, for example, of Bible critics is a history of women. My friend Karen Green always has pointed to in 2014 that the history of equality and the history of enlightenment and what you think what French Revolution is and why you praise this damned Rousseau is in a long tradition of women philosophers who thought about equality and even think that the gnotis eoton is by ancient female priests. So it is neither Socrates, it is also in the tradition of the mythical priests, as we know, and it is perfectly written down in the sources. And we have now also the new technologies. But coming back, reading the history of female philosophers as a history, if you like, first as a history of women philosophers who continuously worked on certain topics and categories, And they did. I have not seen in Meyns, but I will not say that. But this other kind of history will show you that there is a history of equality, of the concept of equality, which is differently applied than the white males Europeans' history of equality, which excluded so many. This equality concept that the women have in Olympe de Gouges, anti-slavery, it's always, you know, it is a universal defense of equality and not a white male European defense of equality. You simply have to read that. But you will also rediscover that important concepts of our philosophy stem from women. So Mary Ellen Wade has shown that also your friend Bertrand Russell, he admitted then later that he has taken some concepts from E.E.C. Jones. It was, so there's but I would like to go simply to two very important concepts and to come back to the concept of space, because what we are showing now with Emily de Châtelet and why she is so important is not only, and I would like to remind you that this is also a narrative which you should not eat and not divulge. This narrative that women have not written philosophical works, but only lectures and sitting in their saloons and so on. This is a narrative also invented to help women out. And it is not true. You have an immense literature, and think of Hildegard of Bingen, think of Cavendish, think of de Châtelet, think of Pizan. So it is all a narrative, and try to jump out of this box, as I used to say. So it is very important to understand again that, and I see de Châtelet in this tradition of these cosmological thinkers, as was Hypatia. Because the concept of space and the idea that the space is what our consciousness helps us to receive as not being us, and to understand that all what is us is what we are related to in our world. That is, that the me and the other is always within the one space concept. It is very important to understand that is de Châtelet and not Kant. And so when we are working hard in these things, so you will rediscover, when you're getting out of the box, many of these plagiarized ideas, and they give you the opportunity to give it also a new interpretation. So I would like also to remind you, and Edith Stein, you know, today is the day of liberation and is Netherlands. And I'm always happy, and I think that Edith Stein is one of the greatest philosophers we have. It's tremendous. And even it's true that Edith Stein wrote the second part, as she wrote so many parts from Husserl. And we have now a big conference, and other conferences on women and phenomenology will come up that show how much women have formed the idea of phenomenology, and that will tell us also what phenomenologists that were great preachers of their time have to be excluded now from the canon. So it is as if we had calculated the planetary system of our sun without taking into account every second planet. Space is the condition of our understanding of anything there is, a dimension that we presume, by which we create a world of related entities. And these relations are dependent on our capacity of reason and imagination. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Ruth Hagengruber, for this lecture that shows the full breadth and range of your research, and is a passionate reminder of the importance of of redoing the history of philosophy. There is space now for questions, and I'm looking at Trijsje, who will read out the questions from the chat. As we go along, please, everyone, feel free to type out your questions in the chat. Trijsje.
Well, we have one question in the chat. I will just read it out loud. from Barbara Be, if I pronounce it rightly. She is writing an article about how the Western philosophy canon helps perpetuate current gender discrimination, not only by underrepresenting women, but also wrongly representing women. Most people are not aware of the strong bias in Western thinking and still see it as universal. My question is, how can we raise awareness on this in education, besides altering curricula and introducing policies? How can we bring on real change in education?
Oh, is this a question I have to respond to?
Yes, I'm afraid.
I usually respond when I can't respond because I don't know. I only can tell you something from my experience on that is that 10 years, I'm doing this for a long while now. And when we started to do so, the people laughed and derided us, you know. And within 10 years now, it got such a wave because it's true. And it's a reliable knowledge. That's the point. And, you know, I could point to all my colleagues here in Germany. They hate me because this history of women philosophers has taken such a movement. And it is them who wanted to be international and being everywhere. But it has become such an important movement. And all the people, males and females, see, like then, Thomas Morus and Tommaso Campanella and so Boccaccio and so many more, always have seen it must be differently. And this is what I'm hoping for. And this is how I would like to encourage you. Keep on, because I never thought that one person can change, or one or a few persons can change so much, you know. But if you have reliable thoughts, I think, then, and if you don't twice yourself in what you're doing, and if you stand by what, it is always the same. It is always the same. So the philosophical claim does not change. We all know what it is to do philosophy and to be strong in keeping to one's own insights and ideas. And we all know what it means to sell you to and to utilitarize, you know, how you can become the most important philosopher. When I studied philosophy, so many friends of mine and female friends of mine, they knew the same things that I knew, but they decided to work on males because they decided and wanted to be successful. So, and each of us stands in that and has to respond to that challenge.
See, thank you. That probably answered the question. There's another one, I'll read it out loud. Veronica Vasterling says, if I understand it correctly, I think you said that Christianity was the first religion without women, but what about Judaism?
Yes, I think I did not say Christianity, did I? I said it was the first religion that is without women. Yeah, and yeah, it is that tradition. Yeah, and I'm not sure if it is, but it is, you know, what we in Europe have now lived. I can't say that for other parts in this world, if they had this dominant male religion too. For example, India has a very male tradition in its ethics too. So the Buddhism, for me, is such a male tradition, and I can't understand, this is another example, why so many women are so enthusiastic for these male-ish traditions. Mm-hmm. So there are other traditions, and yeah, but we have also to face that there are many, many traditions before in the European realm, and let's say in Arabia also, and in the so Babylonian parts and Egyptian parts and African parts, you know, I'm not, but this is all that we have to compare and what has been compared already. Yeah.
Thank you. Veronica, I hope that answered your question. I'll read out the next one, which is from Joyce Platsky Miller, if I pronounce it rightly. He says, thank you so much. Your analysis has significant overlap with work in anti-racist, global and non-Eurocentric philosophy. Sometimes it seems like these discussions do not pay enough attention to one another. So how do we rework the canon so that we do not only pay attention to women philosophers, but also, for instance, to African philosophy?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely true, and it always has been. And I even could remind you to Plato, because Plato referred to the Babylonians, to the Egyptians, and so on. He knew that he did not invent. It was, the westernized idolatrizing that made Plato and Socrates the starters of Western philosophy. But he never said that. He put it other ways. And this philosophy of interrelatedness, of an equality, of understanding oneself, being nested in a world, and that my identity is dependent on this relatedness in the space that I create to exist. It is a different idea of equality, of course, that does not run into problems. And let's say the equality idea of the Western white male is no idea of equality, not here, not there. It is a misuse, and it has to be named a misuse because it was not equality. The universal idea of equality says simply that we are equal. And the question is, what is not so simple? How can we, as we are all different, understand equality? And I think that, as I have said, I think that also the new technology helps us. So, and this is also why I would like to encourage all young women, and that our Defining the Future now for the IAPH is again also to make women strong, to take over and understand the technology as a technology of a global interrelatedness. This is absolutely important. Yeah, and sorry. I hope I responded.
No. I'm sure we love your long answers. I'm sure they do. Again, another one by Karen Vintres. She says, thank you for your lecture. When you state that the history of women philosophers is changing philosophy, do you also mean that the discipline of philosophy as such is changing today?
Yes, of course. And its content must change quickly, because I can name various philosophers that I would throw out. And though I mentioned sometimes Aristotle and so on, you must not throw out everything. There is Rousseau, and there are other idolatrized. I thought about examples, some of these philosophers, like Rousseau. I think even Rousseau was not meant in his time to be a great philosopher by many. He was, one was cared for, he was this and that man. But this was like in Germany, there is Brecht and so on. They are a bit mixing up what other philosophers had said. And even Rousseau has learned a lot from the ladies that cared for him and so on. And so he mixed it up. So many philosophers are simply bad philosophers. And there is another one I would like to mention. So I think Adorno is no philosopher, even Popper, So I haven't spoken about the hypothesis theory, a completely new theory of science that was invented by Du Châtelet. And then Leroux in France, she has now wonderfully shown, but there are many papers on that, on the hypothesis, how Poincaré, Bachelard, all read intensively Du Châtelet's theory of hypothesis, and Popper, always the third one, took it all and then made a big theory out of that. They all have stolen that. And you simply have to go into that, to have to read the text. I had the same libraries as you have. And it is go and read and make you free yourself from the confirmed categories and from what they want you to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, that nicely connects with the next question, which asks, what is, according to you, the main reason for erasing women out of history? It
is not, so I don't know if you say capitalism, since it is often considered to be a dominant factor in driving out women. I don't think so.
Sorry, there's the question before.
Oh, okay, sorry.
For
erasing women, I would say one very important reason was German idealism. So the German 18th century, somebody asked me to write on the German 18th century in 2014, and I have not yet written that completely, but I'm working on that. The 18th century in Germany is so important because it was a very strong rationalism by Louise Gotche, very dominant for whole Europe. Louise Gotche brought Du Châtelet to Germany, to Kant, and so very, very important. But then in the middle of the 18th century broke down, and German idealism, like Kant, like Schiller, like Fichte, they would say, oh, women are equal, but they like to devote themselves and give up their rights for love. You know, then the idea of otherness, also repeated in the philosophy of the 20th century, was a huge factor in the 18th century. So the philosophy of equality changed to become the philosophy of otherness. And Louise Gotche was one of the main fighters against this otherness, because this woman as the other was protected and protéged by the pietists. And Kant was a pietist and said, yeah, women are nice, but they are other, you know, and they have these ideas and so on. And Louise Gotche strongly fought and had a hard life because of that. So I think that it is the incredible importance that the German idealism gained then in the 19th century, because it developed differently in France. France even did not absorb Rousseau as did it Germany, you know. So I think German idealism is a bad boy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then, Liesbeth, one more question perhaps?
I think we need one more question, and perhaps we can go to the question on African philosophy, because there was we already touched upon the question on capitalism, but of course we can go back to that question about other factors in the panel. So let's go to the question on women in African philosophy.
Yeah, the question says that as a discipline, it's very male dominated. So what can we do to give a voice to African women in African philosophy? Louise Müller asked the question.
Mm-hmm. I'm very happy to support every activity in that direction. We already, I don't know if you're aware, but also at the center, we have Ana Rodrigues, a Portuguese. It's good to understand that, because the Portuguese are so close to this history of the colonialism. So she is very active in working on this intercultural philosophy. And we are trying to work on these African women. So we had already certain plans to collect the narratives. You know, when doing, for example, work in the history of ancient women philosophers, of course, there are many women philosophers, and that we should not be deceived, because there is a strong feminist strand in Africa, in many countries, and also live now. And it might be that it is also a bit of Western awareness that is, or Western non-awareness towards this philosophy. But you know, I think, yes, I think if I said it strongly, in my worldview, the African philosophy is already as dominant as the European. But I'm also always annoyed when people in Germany refer to Kant and so instead to the women. That is the outer reality, and the reality of the most of the people has not yet been occupied with this new world. But I think it is it is going forward. Yeah, yeah. And what we can do is, what we can do, I don't have the recipes. So simply also including, I think there are many opportunities by Björn Freiter, by others, to now to bring these, to bring us to talk in dialogue with these African women. We tried that last week in Berlin, but we perhaps it was not sufficiently. But yeah, but it will not be stopped. I'm sure. I'm sure. Because it has, European philosophy has become so unimportant. Who believes that? It is only a tradition that, because it takes a long time before traditions are erased. It takes a long time for the churches and the male gods and so on. But there are not many who still believe that. Mm-hmm. So perhaps this is too optimistic.
No. We love optimism. I'm sure we do. Exactly. So I think, thank you again for your answers. Probably time for a break now, isn't it?
Exactly. I think optimism is the best way to end this lecture. And to start with the break, we'll have a 15-minute break. Welcome back at this session after our keynote lecture by Ruth Hagengruber. We will now have a panel discussion which will last for about 45 minutes, after which there will be plenty of time for questions from the audience, and perhaps also we will still be able to engage with some of the questions that were mentioned in the chat. It's a pleasure to introduce the two other speakers of today. Monika Kirloskar-Steinbach, who is a full professor at the University of Constance, and she will take up the chair by special appointment of diversifying philosophy at Free University Amsterdam as of this September. So she will also be a direct colleague of ours, insofar she isn't yet by being a philosopher. She specialized in world philosophies, Indian philosophy, human rights theory, constitutional theory, ethics of tolerance, philosophy of nationalism, and the history of ideas. And among her recent publications are A Practical Guide to World Philosophies, Selves, Worlds, and Ways of Knowing, together with Lea Kallemanson, as well as Gibt es ein Menschenrecht auf Migration, politische und philosophische Positionen zur Einwanderungsproblematik, which is German for, I'm now translating it into English, Is there a human right to immigration, political and philosophical perspectives? The third panelist of today is Chris Meyns, who is a researcher of early modern philosophy and who is currently working on information systems. And among her more recent publications, which span the early modern history of philosophy, are Information and the History of Philosophy, and together with Adam Werner, Ideen die die Welt veränderten, which are, I believe, both forthcoming, but perhaps Chris will be able to tell
it
more.
It would be quite impressive if we had actually written it in German. Yeah, so, it's translated into German.
Great. So first of all, maybe a question for both Chris and Monika to reflect on the relevance of Ruth's lecture for their own research. And perhaps Monika, would you mind to start?
Okay, firstly, I hope you can hear me. Good. Thanks for the invitation. This is my first event as a member of the FU, and I am very happy to do this because, to my knowledge, this is the first chair, by special appointment nonetheless, but a chair in the whole of the world for diversifying philosophy. I am pretty sure this is the case because I'm involved in different international contexts and can judge the field. Okay, to give you a sense of how my own work resonates with that of Professor Hagengruber, I need to share my screen with you. Not this one. Anyway, I cannot do this now, but for whatever reason, but there's a hitch there. So in 2014, basically, you need to know that I did my doctorate and my habilitation in Germany. Very soon I realized that that which is being taught in Germany is, as Ruth said, simply not the truth. My doctoral supervisor, Trijsje, who came from the Vienna circle, also supported me very much and said, excuse me, that is not rationality which you're getting there in the academy. There was no way I could create space for the kind of work I do and which interests me. I soon realized that that work was done in the United States of America by philosophers. So in 2014, I initiated the Journal for World Philosophies, then in Germany. It was called Confluence, Online Journal of World Philosophies. And the idea was to get that scholarship back to Germany. It did not work because there was no interest. Today, that journal is here. I can do this now. Here. This journal is today with the Indiana University Press. It is an open access journal because I soon realized that we need this for reasons which Ruth has mentioned in her paper for the world. We are in this context not only talking about the Eurocentrism of mainstream philosophy, we are talking about its racism, its outright racism. As you can guess, there are not many funding opportunities for this kind of work. Nobody is interested in this. Academy, especially in Europe, for a long time now, tends to favor comparative, assimilative philosophy, which means talk to me as the European Academy about your metaphysics, and I will decide for you whether that is philosophy. This is in a form of resistance where we do not want to go. In the name of rationalism, for people who understand argumentation theory, you don't need to go there because that is not philosophy. It is basically a travesty of that which is called philosophy. So in addition to this journal, very soon there was a big demand for this. It became a world project, remember, without funding and without funding from the European Academy at all. So then I very soon realized that there was a demand for textbooks, and they expected me to do this because I am chief editor of the journal. So very soon it also went on to, wait, I need to share my screen with you. I mean, in short, two other projects materialized from there. We were told again and again, okay, so you guys claim you have philosophies wherever you come from. Firstly, we don't see them because our European tradition of philology says you guys don't have philosophy, at best only religion, right? So about 3 years ago, we also began this one. This is the Bloomsbury Introductions to World Philosophies. And there's a second series in that at Bloomsbury called the Bloomsbury Studies in World Philosophies. All these projects move away from mainstream philosophy. They push back against the philo-folly, as Ruth called it. They push back against plagiarism. All this means for us, we do not operate with one understanding of philosophy, because if you look at the sources very carefully, it is simply a travesty to call it philosophy. They are very, very many conceptions. So in that list of questions, our philosophy, my first question to you would be, who is the you who claims that there is an our philosophy? Because then we'll have to talk about it. I think, so in many ways, to just, since we're going to have a discussion on this topic, and I would also like to get Chris into the conversation, I can stop here, but I can subscribe to many things to which Ruth has said from my own perspective, and from a perspective which till today, in my view, every student who does philosophy should know. But in my view, the academy, especially here in Europe, systematically keeps out. And remember, especially in this part of the world, we are all very interconnected with other parts of the world, as the pandemic again and again underscores. So we do, if we are proper students of philosophy and if we are doing a proper source work, we should be attending more to the interdependence we have with other parts of the world too. Thanks. That would be my initial statement.
Many, many thanks. I will ask Chris first to make a contribution, and then we can go back to Ruth. Chris.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so you asked me to respond to Professor Hagengruber's Ruth lecture, and I'll also pick up on Monika, Professor Kirloskar-Steinbach's response here. It's just like really amazing, the points that you bring forward, and I'll just pick up on a couple of points that resonated for me specifically. So one of the points I noted in Ruth's lecture was the point about, okay, let's do away with this wrong, fake, fabricated picture of what happened in the history of philosophy when we're looking at that history, because it's just it's contrived, it's made up, and we'll just keep repeating it as though it's something real. But yeah, the way I summarized it was smash everything, which might be a bit too radical, but yeah, I think there needs to be some radical rerouting if we're going to end up with a more accurate history and a more accurate picture of what has really been done in philosophies in the past. And two methodological implications that I saw, or questions that came up for me, which we might address later in the panel, was with the element of categories that Ruth mentioned, and also that were part of Joyce's column in the beginning. So these dichotomies of opposing and classifying, categorizing, and then attributing different values to those categories or labels. One thought I wrote down was, okay, is the best approach methodologically for us to take those categories and then to see how we can fix them? Or should we just say, okay, burn all of that and we'll just read loads of text that are relevant for a particular topic, for a particular circumstance, and start anew? So what methodologically is the best approach? Repairing the fake misleading story or some other approach? And another methodological question that it raised for me was sort of around the theme of the meeting for today, about inclusion and exclusion in the story of the history of philosophy, or in the canon. There is the best way to approach it, the way that you often hear in discussions, to add people to the canon. So we keep the idea that we need to canonize and that we need to have a number of selected texts, and then we'll just do +1, +2, and we get new names. Is it just the whole, or conversely, is it just the whole idea of we need to have the idea of canonization, the idea of best of? Is that something in itself causing many of the problems? And is that something that we just need to let go? So those are two methodological questions. And then on Monika's response just now, definitely this, basically how this history of philosophy in Europe and philosophy in Europe, like absolutely drenched in racism, racist narratives about who gets to do philosophy, who has philosophy. And I saw another link there with Ruth's lecture as well, that at least the history of philosophy as we get taught it now, German idealist or like 19th century German philosophy was a massive factor in presenting this narrative that the history of philosophy started at Greece. Before that, it was always like it goes back to Babylonia and Egypt, but then suddenly there was this narrative of no, it started at Plato. That's really the core. I mean, that's also with yeah. So the German idealists, like they were doing bad things, kicking women out. They were doing bad things, kicking traditions other than what they would want to have as a circumscribed circle of philosophical traditions. So yeah, I think many things to discuss there, and thank you both so much for kicking off this discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Ruth, there's already a lot in these comments, so maybe just pick out one or two themes before we start discussing some of the other issues. Could you maybe pick out one or 2 points by Monika and by Chris? Wait, I don't think we hear you. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. So to Monika, sorry if I call you Monika, and if you call me Ruth, yeah, it would be easier now to hear. So I thank you all for this opportunity to meet Monika, and I think this is a great opportunity to work together for all of us and to continue and to share our possibilities and our powers and so. And so, Monika, did you raise a question towards what I have said? Would you repeat that, or did I not get that? Or
there was no question. It was only a similarity in the projects, in the way we go forward, in the fact that we do exactly your work, but in the world context and taking out racism with sexism. I mean, so there was no question.
Yeah.
Simply because the projects are so parallel to each other. There's so many similarities.
Yes, I would agree. And I really think, and is evident. So to a certain extent, I would always say, and I claim that racism and this anti-feminism or anti-womanism is not the same, but for very interesting reasons that we have to understand, I think on a methodological level. So it's very interesting. There's a lot to be done about that, because why these two big topics always occur at the same time, within the same waves, what is happening there. And I'm very happy to meet you here. So, and to all these questions Chris has now raised, I would like to respond shortly, because it is important for me to say, I mentioned that during my lecture, our lifespan is limited. You will never, it is an utopia, and you will not improve things by saying, okay, we will not have a canon. Because you educate, and each culture educates in its canon and builds up traditions. And evidently, and so the history of philosophy, this is a very particular thing, but we also have to understand that the history of philosophy at the end of the 19th century was somehow raised out. When Analytic and Vienna crisis and so on said, we don't need no history of philosophy, and they really brought in absurd claims on the history of philosophy. So it is all, you can't say doing history of philosophy is a good thing and so on, because many issues are there. And this is the same with canons. So canon reflect the culture, of course. And canons, it is so easy to look at our canon and to judge from a look into our canon what has gone wrong there. Why, the people who are talking about equality give equality only to phenomenologically equal people, so you have, it is a self-prostitution of the wrong ideas in reason. So if you build a new canon, you have this canon has to be, it has to be stabilized. We talk about the European history of philosophy as one huge history of philosophy, which it isn't. Coming back to Christianity, as we have said, when Christianity was introduced in the Western world and before it came up to Finland and to Sweden, it has already crashed down in the south of Europe. And it is always such a we have to understand all these things, and we have to get out of the box, as I usually call that. So yes, we will have a canon, but we have a canon of texts that come up to the understanding we have now, what we think today, what is true, and what is equal. Because it is not, and there are some categories to which we still hold on, like equality. When we talk about world philosophy, we think within the category of liberty, of equality. So there are the big categories that are still prominent. But the problem is on a secondary level, is its application to it. Otherwise, there are categories we dismiss, like we dismiss some houses that have been built and never were very useful, and the very different houses that are built all over the world. So we see that there is a good way to build houses, and categories is nothing else than that. There are categories that are strong and able to include things and to make good constraints, so that the meaning within the categories is stable. But the meaning between the categories of superiorism of males and females and so was not stable. And this was, it is an ongoing fight. It is only because it is not so familiar to the people that this fight, that there are many categories that are weak, and we are not trained, and these critique of these categories has been not allowed for us in the public schools to be read. But I also think it has been said so often, women have not been educated in all this stuff, which might be true in a certain perspective, but which is not true in another perspective. So all these are, narratives. There are, interpretations, and I think they have turned out not to be very stable interpretations. But this does not hinder us to think that there are some categories, so now I conclude on that, like equality, like liberty, that are important for us, but which have been misused in a secondary level. I don't know if I surely have not responded to your many questions, but it is the ontology of, the ontology of his categories of Aristotle. It is clear, building up the boxes. Up is the white male, and they are all equal, but only the white males are equal. And among them is the woman, because he needed the woman to have children. So, and then, and he has such a system of boxes, and this wonderful system of boxes has now created our system of science. And many people, like, for example, the project of space and the category of space is clearly that this category, as it was filled, it was a really problematic category, and it was always filled anew. There is not the space.
Many thanks for both of all three of you for these opening remarks. So maybe to take some steps back, we already discussed the canon, which of course is often conceptualized in rather abstract terms, but let's also reflect on the canon as a very concrete body of maybe texts. So very often one of the problems in rewriting the history of philosophy is connected to the fact that the history of philosophy is narrated as a sequence of influential monographs written by white male European thinkers. And if you want to rewrite the canon, we might also have to look at other text. We might have to look at letters. We might have to look at novels. We might have to look at dialogues. And then on top of that, there's the even additional question that is inspired by a comment that Professor Kirloskar-Steinbach made in one of her papers, that philosophy is also a practice of making meaning, and that practice does not always materialize into text. So I would like to ask you to reflect on this material dimension. What role does this material dimension play in both your research, but also in teaching? What are the texts that we need to rehabilitate, and what is even our, should we even pay that much attention to text, or should we also open up philosophy to include everything that falls outside of these texts? Maybe I'll ask Professor Kirloskar-Steinbach to open this discussion.
Yes, thank you. So in the world philosophical context, pinning philosophy to text is problematic for the reasons you mentioned, simply because we may just be, because that canon which we know today is not only a canon which reflects European achievements in Europe, it is used worldwide, right? So the archival work we have to do, we are doing in the series and in the journal worldwide. It means to even, and we are all trained philosophers, so it also means decolonizing ourselves to do that work, right? So to go there, you basically have to open your own self, as Ruth said in her talk, to other ways of seeing, to other ways of even understanding what a category can mean. Because with those texts, we come back and discuss them in research, in conferences with fellow philosophers. Now, if they are not specialists in these traditions, we have to hang on those categories to the categories we normally know in mainstream philosophy. And this is where the problem begins, because this is where assimilation begins itself. Right? What is substance? What is time? What is space? This is, so basically to open up that whole, you have to develop a very fluid understanding of what a philosophical category is and can be. This is then also related to the canon. I'm doing this work now for maybe about 10 years. And today I'm very wary of that word canon. Because, and even rewriting the history of philosophy, it is something which is not going to happen in my lifetime. That much I know. I would do think that we need to retain the canon we do to problematize it, because that is our socialization as philosophers. So instead of saying, okay, chuck them out, yes, chuck them out, but before you add new ones, have a global debate on who to add, why to add, is one canon enough? What does the canon do? As Chris very well said, is this just the best of, or are these our problem children? Yeah, and as Joyce said earlier, we can't leave that past behind. We need to take it forward with us. Yeah. So how to write the canon, rewrite the canon, this is something, given my own work in world philosophy, I would say it is very problematic. That word canon itself flags so many methodological issues that I do not see myself in a position to give you a clear answer about it. How do I do that with my students? I just open up my philosophy courses to all kinds of material. And I'm now, for the first time, facing a batch of students, especially in Germany, very interesting. Happens to me only in Germany. I must say I've not taught as yet in the Netherlands, so I don't know. But I've taught in the US, in India, and in Germany, and I'm always very surprised about how my German students push me for more. It's very funny. They are in a system, in a living, in an academic system, which does not at all give them that plurality. in terms of text, in terms of women philosophers, yes, there's a new debate now, but in terms of multiculturalism and plurality. And I'm always surprised, they're the ones who are very impatient for more. So we do need to do all this, and we need to do it in Germany, and we have to rethink the categories we're using in the German debate, because those are very problematic till today. That's what I can say for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Chris, could you maybe respond to the question about the materiality and or to Monika's response?
Yeah, definitely. There are so many lines of like notes and thoughts that I jotted down in response to all of this. So in terms of the materialities, that actually ties in with the book that you mentioned that Adam Ferner and I just finished, and which is coming out this summer. Because there we, so the title is The Philosopher's Library, and the idea was that we would look at philosophy books. So yeah, books that are somehow understood to be philosophy. And then the first challenge that we had is, okay, the book is, if you look at the entire span of the history of philosophy, it's a quite novel invention. Like maybe it's been around for a couple of millennia, but philosophy is much older than the invention of the book. So we cast out like the formal bound set of sheaves as any sort of criteria for being an official philosophy marker. And I think, yeah, once you see that that's a quite novel invention, then you think, why should, so the materiality matters definitely in terms of what got preserved. So certain materials are, yeah, easily burnable, and then they might not stand, they might not be kept for a longer period over time. So their material makes a massive difference. But in terms of once you've got the material preserved, either in some sort of inscription or through oral tradition, I'm inclined to be like really, really flexible about what I'm happy to treat as philosophy. And especially today, there are so many different formats in which people do writing and perform writing of philosophical works. Like, is a tweet, is that a work of philosophy, depending on the context? So I'm super, super flexible with the material side of things. And yeah, I think in terms of the point of canonization and what gets kept or not. So I think I'm a bit more skeptical about the idea that the tool of canonization, which I labeled it the best of, like I would see that as a selection of the entire body of philosophical works that's out there. So I think maybe to ensure that we're not talking past each other, I would distinguish between that and a repository or a library or the entire collection of works. So that definitely, I think, is super helpful. Like, preserve all of the philosophical works that you can preserve, make them public, put them online so that they're like accessible, perform them in public spaces, like give everyone access to whichever works we still have in whatever form is available. The way I see this idea of a canon, which I agree is maybe not even useful anymore, because the term, it just gets yeah, different uses in different circumstances. I would see that as a selection from this collective heritage library or repository, shared within a larger group of people, saying, read these, or like whatever you read, in any case, read these. Something like that, because like life is short, you need to make some sort of selection in terms of what you read. But why does that need to be predetermined, like within a discipline? So if I teach a class, I need to suggest to students, okay, read these, and then maybe here you can follow up. But that might depend on the specific circumstances. And I'm more skeptical that something like the best of within a specific discipline is needed to make these selections. but it might be that like there's some sort of, yeah. Okay, I'll leave that.
Many thanks, and thanks for pointing out indeed the difference between a canon and the conservation of so-called major or key authors versus a repository.
Yeah, so I definitely didn't mean that we should burn libraries, so definitely don't do that.
So maybe can I ask Ruth to comment on the specific materiality as someone who has extensive experience in teaching, researching, editing, translating text, and making them accessible to people, just like Chris mentioned with regard to the repository of text.
So I would like again to start to tell a story from my own experience. I was for 10 years a lecturer at the University of Cologne. And one professor gave me the opportunity there to be a lecturer, but the others were very against me, you know. And I did my lectures on philosophy of information science and on the history of women philosophers. And those on the history of women philosophers I used to call the victories of reason. So, and as it was highly combated, derided, and so on, I had developed a methodology there that was to read texts anonymized in parallel with my students. So I read Plato and ancient texts of women philosophers, of Azara, of Lucania, whom I love very much, and I think. And this goes now to the question, what is philosophy? So because I think there is the question, what is philosophy? I think philosophy is something. So I would not say it is meaning. There are philosophers that produce our meaning and who produce the narrative. But there are philosophers who are trying to stabilize what we know and what we can rely on. And these women philosophers I have mentioned are for me idols. Perhaps I also idolatrize them. Surely I idolatrize Émilie de Châtelet, as has been Kant and is still idolatrized by many. And because in her writings, I can point to many, many issues that are very important for me, that are very important for my understanding what philosophy is, and for my understanding, yes, of filling up the categories I'm using and so on. And I can't start at the zero. So I'm starting with that, and I'm comparing texts. And now I'm comparing, do compared readings from Kant and de Châtelet. And I asked the students, and they, you know, I presented in a way to them, and anonymized a reading was for me always a very important instrument to read. Of course, you have to be very careful, very intelligent, I say, because there is very bad parallel reading that also insinuates you to go this and that direction. So even this, to do this, you have to be, you know, I say now in the philosophical sense, honest people, because the misuse of that is, of course, our history long. So, but I would claim to the point that I would always claim to the issue that there is something which is philosophical and which is at the core of cultures and at the core of striving for sense in life, and which we all have in common, of course, and so on. But there is something philosophical, and then to how does it realize this philosophy? I insist on the fact that all cultures have institutionalized practices. When we come back now, so we have wonderful Indian students also in our, you know, in our center here. And she presented at the last New Voices section, the female philosophers from India from the 11th century. And others present Arabian thinkers. And the one scholar here pointed to the woman who created this university and so on. So there are so many there is the idea of institutionalized thinking, I think. And it has been in the Arabian, and although it is of course true that then strange people and sexualized people have been brought out of important institutions, or to make one's own institution important, one had to combat other people. But and institutions are of course instruments of domination, instruments of power, no doubt. But no doubt, we are trying now to give power to the insights we share. You know, we try to do the same. We try to institutionalize, and we defend our ideas as the better ones. So I think we can't say, oh, we don't canonize, oh, we don't do that, and so on. We are all, because we ignore so much. We are blind. I'm so blind, you know. This is a tiny thing that I know, which is added, and this is a core condition under which we live, and we have to face to have to think about how we live that, in the way we want to live, in a democratized way, in a way of shared insights, and of not dominant and violently dominating views.
Many thanks. I think we can talk maybe a little bit more about this institutional context, which is another really big question about how philosophy comes about, right? If we want to avoid an unsituated way of thinking about philosophy, we have to think about the spaces where philosophy is done. And of course, we've seen major differences with regard to the institutions where that is done. So traditionally, of course, philosophy was not necessarily institutionalized at universities.
Never, sorry when I say that, but Descartes, Leibniz, or other mythicists and so on, they have not been at university. University, this is a short idea of the 19th and 20th century, you know. And we can't say about institutionalization as if because women had only access from 19 blah 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 so on, because it's a very short story. In the 17th century, nobody went to the university, and those and others clearly went beyond universities that were always serving the dominant views. Yeah. Sorry.
So just to go back to the question about the universities, these are very useful and helpful illustrations of exactly the dynamic that we're interested in when we think about the situatedness of thinking. So we see indeed that philosophy becomes more and more institutionalized, but then also the ways of thinking against the canon have become increasingly institutionalized. From the 1980s onwards, we see how women's studies, gender studies have become institutionalized within the university, which has elicited its own critique, right? In a sense that there seems to be a division between feminist practice and feminist theory. And also, but a bit more contentiously, perhaps, we see the institutionalization of critical race and decolonial perspectives. I think it's fair to say that insofar feminism and decolonial practices still have a strong foothold in actual practices, also the theory is more closely wedded to it. But I was wondering how you could reflect, if you could reflect on these developments, in particular as you're also engaging with authors who are actually historically situated very differently. So how can we think about your own situatedness, your own situation within a university, vis-a-vis the situation of the authors, and perhaps also the political actors you're engaging with in your work? I might ask Monika to go first, if that's okay.
Okay, so let me talk about my own experience here. I have served in the Diversity Committee of the American Philosophical Association for 3 years. When you're part of that association, you have the right to suggest panels for all the big meetings of the APA. I've done meetings for all their chapters. This institutionalization itself, yeah, because it goes back to the civil rights movement and to have academic philosophy reflect demographics of the US American situation. This institutionalization has been enormously important for my own work, because till then I did not come in contact. It has not only been important for all the journal work and all those the books I do and edit, it has also been important for my own ways of seeing and my own ways of pluralizing my philosophical heritage. Yeah, by which I do not only mean the Indian. My socialization as a philosopher is German. Yeah, those 3 years for academic work at the American Philosophical Association have heavily influenced the work I do today. Today, I am not worried about the fact that the authors I am working on they push back. I'm working on authors in colonial India. Some of them trained as philosophers in Germany, yeah, who came back to India and said, hey, wait, what we are having here is conceptual colonization. And we have to push back, resist it. If I had remained in the German language context itself, I would have had problems to even publish this work in German for lack of interest, yeah, and did not have that kind of academic conversation with the people I do today. Today, in all those projects in which I'm involved, we are not worried about what academic philosophy does with itself or with us. Yeah, as Ruth said, life is short, very short for us. We do our own kind of work. And this has had an enormous influence in the publishing I do today. Which when I come back to Germany, I'm always asked at conferences, are you sure you're a trained philosopher? Because you work very differently. I would like to get this kind of institutionalization to the European context, because it makes us richer as philosophers. And if you have pots of gold lying somewhere on European roads, tell me where to get it, because there's a huge bunch of scholars out there, doctoral, postdoctoral. We're all doing this kind of work without funding currently. They're all out there on the road. So, because this, at the end of the day, it's all about finding meaning for our own selves, taking that past with us into the future. Yeah, and for which we need funding. And at the end of the day, then, as Ruth said, all that masculinist, virile, toxic argument, counter-argument, you don't need all that. It's also bad to do that as a person. You can engage with this rich topos of philosophy lying out there, waiting for us to discover it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for which I would suggest in forums like this one, we just coalesce, come together and take this work forward. I mean, there are enough of people around the world doing this kind of work now. 10 years ago, one could have said, hey, wait, don't go there. Now, I don't think you have an excuse for that.
Thanks. That is indeed a very useful reminder that the international mobility that is so much praised within academia can also actually be used against itself by subverting academia from within. Chris, would you, can I ask you to respond?
Yeah, sure. So the point that specifically resonated for me around this theme of institutionalization was the point that Ruth made also a moment ago, that the institution will always work to preserve itself and to preserve the dominant view. And philosophy, at the same time, I would say philosophy isn't academic philosophy. Philosophy happens everywhere. It happens out on the street, like when people reflect on mathematics, their lives, or the ethics of using drones to hover over neighbors' gardens or whatever. Like, it happens all of the time. So in order to have philosophy, and in order to have philosophy flourished, it's not necessary that that happens in institutions or in the academy. Would the institution or institutionalized philosophy or philosophy in the academy benefit from philosophy being changed, like from people spending all the energy to remove all the falsehoods and remove all the distortions? Definitely. Like, the academy would benefit loads, and it would become much better and a much less toxic place than I have experienced it to be so far. Is it worth the energy? Like, is the academy worth repairing? In my notes, I put down a big question mark. So yeah, I'm not decided on that. Yeah, I think I'll keep my response to that point. Yeah.
Thanks. The question about what the status is, if philosophical departments can still be saved, yes or no, and if it's worth our energy, or philosophy will outlive our departments. I think it's a very helpful reminder. Perhaps, Ruth, would you mind following up on the discussion?
I think I think this is wonderful. I have nothing to add here.
Great. I want to start. Oh, okay. Wait, sorry. I think Monika wants to say something.
Yeah. Can I just add something? I think, I mean, one point, and I think it, which I picked up from Chris and from Ruth. Basically, we need this kind of work not for others, but because of that materiality you talked about. We find, at least in my career till now, I find myself at a juncture where you can make a change by directing the attention of philosophers worldwide to these sources. And today it is through that written text. Yeah. So I don't call it the canon, but for me, it is work, as she said, on a repository. It is a repository we leave behind to people who are sitting somewhere in the world and saying, but wait, I mean, questions of life interest me, but I don't want to go into academic philosophy. Well, you don't, but you have that repository. And this is something I think even Ruth said as well as Chris. So yes, that's where that materiality comes in. Work, for archival work, which we are doing in the past, where those sources are not being material. Yeah, they're not always the text, but we sort of materialize them today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial. Yeah.
There are a number of questions in the chat, and rather than reading them out, I'm going to try to synthesize them with some of the issues we've discussed so far, and also some of the issues that we hope to get to. Of course, one of the questions about recuperating forgotten traditions is also perhaps the recuperation of overlooked or devalued concepts or ideas. So one idea that is very crucial, for instance, when we reread the history of philosophy, for instance, is the rehabilitation of the relational dimension of subjects vis-a-vis each other, which can be traced maybe also to a specific reading of love, for instance, but that can also be read throughout other non-Western traditions of thinking, such as Ubuntu philosophy. At the same time as there's being asked in the chat, and I'm going to read out this question by Luana Goulart. There is the issue that such a new canon might repeat the same mistakes of those being built in Europe. So there is a risk that the new canon will not really have new philosophical concepts. So my question for you, also relating to the notion of conceptual colonization, how can we still, what do we win with these new philosophers? And can we find new concepts so to speak? Or will it just be a repeating of the same concepts? Perhaps Ruth could go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to these two questions. So first, yes, I think that the idea of philosophy and metaphysics on the basic of interrelatedness is as an old idea as it is the idea of hierarchies. And I even think that within different realms of reality, let's say in mechanics, it might be that an ontology of hierarchies is the right way to go. It might even think about information science today. It is now the new ways of doing information science and going beyond the logical and ontological hierarchies, which have built up the Google things, and now the very different idea to retrieve information by the new quark systems and so on. So this is so we are at the beginning of human, I don't want to say mankind, of the world. We have not much experience. So our world is incredibly young. And I think even our language is so poor and our philosophy is still so poor. Nonetheless, so first idea, I think the hierarchical thinking is as strong and already well established in tradition as it is the interrelated thinking. There might be different traditions all over the world that force the one or the other direction, and there are different times in the world that promote the one or the other way of thinking more. As I tried to show, we have, or also in the European tradition, we have strong influence of this interrelated. Renaissance philosophy is all that. Tommaso Campanella is a very favorite philosopher I love very much. He only speaks of interrelated blah, blah, blah. And he also makes very strong the cause of women. So this is the one thing. There are these ideas. Yes, and this idea of love, although women have been expelled from the institutions, but Hildegard of Bingen, they have accompanied us throughout the histories. And many people were unimpressed by the fact that they were not taught at the institution. So this is the second is that we all, as we are sitting here, are, however, claiming that our children in school will read and will be educated in a different canon, but this is also a canon. It is also, this is an assemblage of ideas we hold to be true today. So, and of course, and I will claim that with all the philosophical instruments that are at hand for me, that this, what we are proposing here, is a much better canon, because it's less violent and so on. Yeah, there are many reasons, less contradictory and things like that. So, and then, yes, there will be the same concepts. Nothing new under the sun. So I don't believe that. The question is, where is the violence? And if we are all allowed to say what we think, what is the truth, has two problematic issues at two different ends. First, there are many countries in this world where you are not allowed to say what you think. And secondly, even if you live in a country where you are allowed to say what you think, you are too weak to say what you really think, because you think it's better to follow some mainstream thoughts. And sometimes, sorry for saying that, but for a certain kind, it becomes mainstream now, the feminist thing. But the feminist thing, nonetheless, I think, is a much truer and a much more justified way of thinking, because it's much less violent, it's less contradictory. And when I defend the feminist thought and the feminist tradition, then I do this again by bringing in established philosophical categories. So there is now, these have been my responses to the two questions. So the philosophy of interrelatedness forever, yes. So is there new? What is new? Yes, there will be. It will be very new to see and to organize this world. We will build the house of our world completely differently. It is, now we build boxes, but then we build relations all over the world, which will flourish and develop in a very different kind of sciences, of production, of economics, because it's a very different basic that we have at the start of this, how things are built together. Yeah.
Many thanks for reminding us of the poverty of our language and the poverty of our philosophical vocabulary and the hidden, if not ignored, tradition of a concept that is nowadays perhaps even hyped, the relationality and the interrelatedness of us, which has a way longer pedigree than we might think if we run a Google search for these terms. Monika, can I ask you to respond maybe as well to the cluster of these same things?
Yeah.
Do we need new concepts, and where are they coming from, perhaps?
Okay, so the idea that everything new will push out the old and will be on the best way to model relativism, for me, has to do with the fact that we're ignorant about other traditions. Because from all that work I do myself, and I see in the journal and in all the other projects I do, I have not encountered a single position which says, okay, we are incoherent and inconsistent and let's call ourselves philosophy. Yeah, I'm waiting for someone to come with this position. It is not the case. Apparently across cultures, and you can take any kind of materialization you want, poetry, painting, whatever. When you're trying to make meaning out of your own life, or the meaning of a human in the universe, those positions tend to look for coherency and consistency. The problem with racism is to say that coherency and consistency can only be had in the European tradition. That is the problem. Yeah. So I'm talking. So when new concepts come, what happened to the old? It is a question which is too complex, I think. I mean, there's no easy answer to that. But I do, going from my current work, would like to get an aspect into the debate, which is again underscored again and again by the people I'm working on currently, who say, they're all trained philosophers, who say concepts are dangerous because they block you from seeing other parts of the world. Because you say, hey, wait, that's my concept. I know how to apply it. Yeah. And the moment you then stick and say, okay, I'm not taking on anything new because I have my concept, then you close your mind as a philosopher. That is, and this is something which, it is an insight which I find very useful for my work. So yes, I see my work as being conceptual and highly methodological. But what happens to the old concepts? I think we have to talk a lot about positionality, about interrelatedness, and all these very complex philosophical debates to even begin to consider what happens with the old ones when we go forward. I mean, it's a very complex philosophical debate. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, many thanks. Chris, do you have anything to add to the discussion about concepts?
Yeah, well, I guess just a tiny point with this idea of, okay, what happens with when you get a new canon and replacing the old canon. So I had already indicated that I'm not like the greatest fan of making this best of or like selected reading idea. But I guess if that's what you want to do, so Ivana Gola, who poses the question, indicates I still have people who come to Europe or the USA to learn about women philosophers. Like, if you want to do this in any way, it's got to be massively collaborative. It's just across the world, people starting from their different traditions and then collaborating on making something new. It definitely shouldn't be the case that someone in the US or someone in Europe authorizes what the new canon is going to be. So yeah, and that comes back to Monika's point, funding. So how are you going to fund such a massively collaborative network? And that's, I think, if the EU is listening and wants to make a contribution, here's one point that they can jump in.
We're already reaching the end of the meeting. So then, of course, the key question is, what are we going to do with the term of philosophy? We already had one question in the chat, which was asking about the usefulness or the importance of the category of Western philosophy. I believe that might refer to the specification of the region where Western philosophy is happening. But we might also want to expand on that question. Like, if philosophy is perhaps so deeply mired in this Eurocentric notion of a transmission of a specific body of text, or if philosophy is otherwise highly problematic because of its dichotomies, for instance, do we maybe want to get rid of the term? Does the term philosophy actually do justice to all these practices that we now name under philosophy? So would it be time perhaps for SWIP-NL to get rid of the P and replace it with another letter, or no letter at all, perhaps?
This is where you need to consult a branding consultant.
Perhaps, Ruth, can I ask you to respond first?
So what philosophy means is that we are striving for knowledge, to know, and having edited now saying so, also the women from antiquity, of course, they do philosophy without doing the word philosophy, because this is also an idolatrized Western tradition to call it philosophy. But this does not say that we don't know that we understand something when we say that word, So of course we can get rid of that word, and Mary Ellen Waite is now, who wrote this 4-volume history of Western women philosophers, is now writing, and we are very happy for that, the history of non-Western philosophy. And I all would like to encourage you, and I'm happy. So those people who are working on that, I'm very happy if we get in touch and we promote each other and we support each other, first to get this funding and to make it clear. So, but coming back to the P word or to the phi word, yes. So we know, the philosophers before Plato who started to philosophize about the world, philosophy. Philo, that's love. That's love, we are back. We can call it, it has so many words in so many countries. So, and we know what it means. This is the important thing. Yeah. And abolishing philosophy for the phi word does not by itself, it might support to abolish also this dominant tradition. But as I have said, I think, this dominant tradition is, but the most difficult thing in the world is to reflect about things that there are, and to look at it and say, what is useful there and what is not useful. It is always you go and abolish it, go and so, but all those abolishes, and dismisses. It is not that Robespierre has created a better world, as we know.
Thank you. Monika, could I ask you to reflect on the relevance, the urgency, or the absolute unimportance of philosophy, Western philosophy as a term?
not so much about Western philosophy, but I do lead projects on philosophies in the plural for a particular reason, because we're talking about the embodied nature of philosophizing. We're talking about the fact that for the work we do, we are still trying to even understand what would be an adequate methodology. The fact that we are pushing back against philosophical neocolonialism, yeah, and the fact that when you look at the history of humankind, there has always been philosophy, not only in Europe, in all other parts of the world. What has happened in Europe also has a lot to do with plagiarizing. Yeah, taking sources and then claiming they're your own. As Ruth said, it's again, there's a parallel here. So for me, I am wedded to the concept of a plural. Also because I work with feminist cross-cultural philosophies on related knowing. It has a lot to do with methodology, subject-object binary, and all these kinds of things. So I am wedded to that word philosophies. It also makes sense because it is the love of wisdom. I do not buy into the argument that people like me should use the term wisdom traditions for the work we do, because that itself is a very colonial category. And it doesn't, as a philosopher, make sense to me. While one thing should be called philosophy, the other thing should be called wisdom traditions. And there was a question also about the interdisciplinarity of philosophy in the chat. Just to briefly take that up, for me, the future of philosophy is interdisciplinarity. There is the academic philosophy we know today. It is, for me, it is simply not a plausible alternative. It is not a plausible alternative for me as a philosopher to understand my place in the world. And I do not think I'm the only person with this view. Thanks.
Last but not least, I want to give the word to Chris to reflect on the discipline of philosophy. Philosophy is disciplining its members, disciplining its limits, and perhaps also disciplining us in talking about the word of philosophy.
There's a lot of disciplining going on anyway. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so for the burn things down I've said in the conversation so far today, I'm not, it hadn't occurred to me to abolish the term philosophy. So here, my idea was just my attitude, and also in the book that I wrote with Adam Ferner, our attitude has just been to be like maximally flex and inclusive about philosophy. So yeah, I would count anyone who's reflecting on their circumstances, on like force or whatever, or on any type of thing in nature or in the world, or how they relate to others, as some form of philosophy. And then, yeah, once we start studying this, sometimes that practice of reflecting on the nature of things or how things work, retrospectively, it gets classified as physics, or it gets classified as anthropology, or it gets classified as literature or other type of theory. Yeah, we can make those classifications, but yeah, it's still this reflecting on the nature of things. And I think that also ties in with the question about interdisciplinarity that Rebecca Wilkin indeed raised in the chat. So at the moment, I'm part of an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary project. So we've got anthropologists, philosophers, people from literature, and archaeology. And I think I've never learned more philosophy from talking to this group of people. I would also say I've learned more philosophy on the internet than being engaged in philosophy departments. So I think, yeah, with abolishing the term philosophy, no, just go ahead, be super inclusive and flexible. And I think then, yeah, we might be able to make progress in how we understand things in the world.
Thank you. I would like to thank our speakers of today, Chris Meyns, Monika, Kirloskar-Steinbach, and Ruth Hagengruber. We all, I'm speaking on behalf of everyone because at least I learned a lot, and it was a super, super great discussion to reflect on all these issues that we are all trying to grapple with as critical readers of philosophy, the history of philosophy, and the practice of philosophy. This was an event organized by SWIP-NL. I would love to take up the invitation that our speakers articulated to work together on collaborative projects. If anyone is interested, we have a newsletter with SWIP-NL. If there's anything you would like to be mentioned in that newsletter, send us a message and we'll definitely distribute it amongst our members. And our members include both those philosophers who are officially affiliated to a university, but also those who are actually practitioners of philosophy in the widest sense of the word, which is just following up on a theme that we also discussed today. I would like to thank the tolken, the translators of today, who did an amazing job, because I already heard from many people how happy they were with the translation. I would like to invite everyone in thanking the speakers, and we really hope to see you again soon. And perhaps the first occasion we will see you can be fairly soon, because we have a lecture by Sophie van Balen on Friday, June 18th, which is entitled Home Tactics, Atmospheric Care and Agonistic Realism, Ingredients for an Environmental Politics. You can find more information about that on our website, SWIP-NL. That's it. I would love to invite everyone to go and grab a drink and hang around. We'll definitely leave open this Zoom call for a little bit longer. And we all wish you a very, very great weekend. Thank you, everyone.